So a question I frequently get with younger artists is, what frame rate do you work on? How many frames is this? And it sparks a conversation that is usually plagued with a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the subject simply because there's not a simple source of information regarding frame rates and their origin when an artist opens an animation program for the first time. So let's talk about it. Frame rates come from film, this old-timey thing that no one sees or uses anymore, but it still deeply influences how visual media is encoded to this day. This is a film strip. On the side are little peg holes the projector uses to turn two ends of a spool so that the center squares, or frames, pass through the projector fast enough to trick the eye into thinking that the images are moving. Back in the day when film and animation were evolving concurrently, it was standardized that projectors rotate at a speed of 24 frames per second. For the most part. When television came around, that was actually increased to a rate of 30 frames per second because of the way the cathode ray tubes worked and refresh rates, which is where the second standardization of rate comes from. There's also a third standard rate, 25 frames per second, which I'm not sure where it's used and I largely ignore because of reasons which will soon be apparent. When it comes to animation, animators quickly realize that if you hold each image of the animation for 2 frames, that cuts the workload in half and doesn't really degrade the effect of most animation movements. This is called working on twos, because you create a new image for every second frame. You'll see that if your base frame rate is 24 frames per second and you're working on twos, then this also means that it is 12 frames per second, which is basically how most American animation is animated. The film itself is 24 frames in a second, but every other instance, I suppose, or image is a copy of the one before, usually, in most shots. If you actually slow down films like The Lion King and go frame by frame between shots, sometimes they'll have a shot that is actually every single frame, so that would be 24 frames per second, but a lot of them will be every other, and that's 12 frames per second. So those terms, working on twos and 12 frames per second, are pretty interchangeable. The same is also true for TV standard. If you cut 30 frames per second down to twos, you will be working on 15 frames per second. The third standard rate is not divisible by 2, the 25 frames per second, and I've never seen it used in animation really kind of ever, unless we're talking about like web design and GIFs, which run at 25 frames per second. So I still don't have a solid idea on what 25 frames per second is for. This also means that you can even work on lower standardized frame rates, like every third frame, which is working on 3s, or every fourth frame, which is working on 4s. The fewer frames you use, however, the less fluid your movements will be, and so it's usually up to the director or artist to decide what their limits are when choosing frame rates for the production. So that's the history. These days though, you open any animation program, and though they may have those base frame rate settings as presets, you can usually set your frame rate for anything that you want. That's fine, right? If I only have to animate 9 frames a second, that's easier for me, right? Maybe, if you're only animating for your project. But if you're contributing to a larger project, having non-standardized frame rates makes editing a nightmare. Let's look at this using film strips. When I am putting together film, I can cut and paste pieces and tie them together so that they run smoothly through the projector. There's a lot of additional technical information like tracking that prevents the frames from flickering or sliding, but pretend that we don't have to worry about any of that stuff. We instead are just talking about the frames. Here's a strip that runs at 24 frames per second, and here's one that runs at 30 frames per second. If you edit these together in the same project, you're going to have frames that drop, as in don't get played at all, because they don't match the 24 frames per second project standard. Equally, using a non-standard lower frame rate, like 18 frames per second, means that some of these frames will be held for longer than others, even though, in the making of each frame, it was created to hold for the same amount of time. Back in the old days, you would not have been able to edit any of these together at all, but because of computers, they do their best to interpolate incompatible frame rates, and it results in projects that have jittering errors. This is frustrating as an editor, and it's frustrating as a participant because when you made your part, it played back and it was smooth. All of this can be solved by choosing your frames based upon standardized frame rates. If you want to work on a lower frame rate, open your project at a base frame rate and hold your images for longer than one frame, like 2s or 3s or 4s. In doing this, you can even do variable frame rates where you draw new images as needed by the action. I think that's all that I have to say about that. Please use industry standard base frame rates. It makes the life of your project editor easier, and hopefully prevents headaches when this conversation comes up in the future. Thank you for watching, and remember, industry standards are your friends.